June 14, 1944. A village in Normandy called Lingevres. The stones were still smoking. On a road running east out of that village, a British sergeant sat inside a tank that looked wrong. And down that road, hidden somewhere in the afternoon haze, Panther tanks were coming for him. He did not know yet how many there would be. He could see two of them in his binoculars, 800 meters out, closing fast, 45 tons of German steel apiece. Guns that could kill his tank from nearly a mile and a half away. His name was Wilfred Harris. He was 33 years old. He had a wife back in Walsall in the West Midlands. He had already walked off one beach with nothing in his hands at Dunkirk 4 years earlier. And in the next few minutes, he was going to fire 5 rounds from a gun that his own government had tried to strangle in a shed on the Dorset coast. And every single one of those rounds was going to find its mark. The tank he was sitting in did not look like the other tanks in his troop. The barrel was too long. It stuck out past the front of the hull by nearly 2 meters, thin and dark against the ruined skyline. There was a steel box bolted to the back of the turret that no American factory had ever put there. Inside the tank, where a second machine gunner should have been sitting, there were racks of shells, too big for the Sherman that had been built to carry them. And the breech of the main gun did not open upward like every other tank gun in the British Army. It opened sideways, left to right, because there was no other way to make it fit. Every other Sherman in Normandy carried a 75mm cannon. Harris's tank carried something else, something called the 17-pounder. And the men who had first put that gun inside this turret had been ordered, in writing, to stop. To understand what Wilfred Harris was about to do in the next few hours, and why every armored crewman in the Allied armies would soon know his name, you have to understand what was happening to British tanks in the first 2 weeks after D-Day. When the landing craft opened on June 6, 1944, the men rolling off them believed they were ready. 2 years of training. They knew their Shermans down to the smell of the oil in the transmissions. They trusted the 75mm gun. It was reliable, it was accurate, it could throw a shell almost 2 miles. What nobody had told them was what was waiting in the hedgerows. The Panther, the Panzer Mark V, 45 tons of German engineering. Frontal armor 80mm thick, sloped at 55 degrees, which gave it the effective resistance of nearly 140mm of solid steel. A British Sherman firing at 75 could punch through about 68mm at 500 yards. Do the math slowly. A British crew could drive at a Panther head-on, at close range, firing every round in the tank, and every single shell would bounce off the front plate. The Panther's gun, meanwhile, could kill a Sherman from nearly a mile and a half away. This was not a disadvantage. This was a death sentence. And here is the fact you need to hold on to for everything that follows. In June of 1944, on the day the invasion began, the British Army possessed exactly one type of tank-mounted weapon capable of killing a Panther from the front. One. And the men who had built the tank carrying that weapon had been ordered in writing to walk away from the project and never touch it again. The story of how that gun ended up inside Sergeant Harris's turret does not begin in Normandy. It begins in the Libyan desert 2 years earlier with a man who had been thrown out of a burning tank and who could not stop hearing the sound. May 27, 1942, a place called Gazala. Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge was 40 years old, an experienced armored officer, sitting inside an American-built Grant tank in the middle of Rommel's counterattack. The Grant carried a 75mm gun, the same caliber that would later arm the Sherman. Witheridge's crew fired at the German Panthers coming through the dust. The rounds hit. The rounds fell away. Then something hit the Grant. The world went white and hot. Witheridge was blown out of the turret. He came down in the sand, broken and burning, and he lived. He survived. But when the doctors were finished with him, the Army looked at his file, and the Army made a decision. Unfit for combat duty, they sent him to a desk. And this is the first thing you need to notice. The man who was about to change the course of British armor for the rest of the war was a man the Army had already written off. A man who was supposed to disappear into paperwork. A man who should not have mattered anymore, but Witheridge remembered. He remembered the flat, hollow clang of the shells falling off Rommel's tanks. He remembered the feeling of firing a weapon that could not reach the thing that was trying to kill him. He remembered the smell of the inside of the Grant when it started to burn. He carried that sound with him for the rest of the war. In early 1943, the Army sent him to Fort Knox in Kentucky. 6 months, advising the Americans on tank gunnery. He arrived expecting to teach. What happened instead was that he drove their new Sherman tanks, and he saw what the machine could do. Reliable, fast, mechanically simple, easy to repair, easy to build in numbers no British factory could match. He came back to England in June of 1943 with a conviction, not in the Sherman's gun. He knew the 75 was already obsolete, but in the Sherman itself, the chassis, the engine, the hull, the platform. The gun was the problem. The tank was the answer. All someone had to do was put the right gun on it. And Britain had a gun, the 17-pounder, a British anti-tank weapon of just over 3 inches in caliber that could punch through 140 millimeters of steel at 1,000 yards. On paper, everything the 75 was not. It could kill a Tiger, it could kill a Panther, it could kill anything the Germans had. But it was sitting on the ground behind a towed shield instead of inside a tank, because the 17-pounder was enormous. When it fired, the breech traveled a full 3 feet and more backward. Violent recoil, slamming into a turret that had maybe 18 inches to spare. Every engineer who looked at the problem said the same thing. It does not fit. The turret is too small. The recoil is too long. It cannot be done. Witheridge was posted in June of 1943 to Lulworth, the Royal Armoured Corps Gunnery School on the Dorset coast. He arrived expecting to evaluate the A-30 Challenger, Britain's official answer to the heavy German tanks. He inspected the Challenger and joined what the records politely call the chorus of complaints. It was overweight. It was unreliable. It was months, maybe a year, from being ready for battle. It would not make D-Day. But someone at Lulworth had already been thinking about the same problem Witheridge was thinking about. His name was Major George Witheridge. He was 35 years old, Royal Tank Regiment, and he had done something in a shed at Lulworth that every qualified engineer in Britain had said was impossible. He had put the 17-pounder inside a Sherman turret. There was a catch, and Witheridge could not solve the recoil problem. Nobody could. So he had simply removed the recoil system entirely. He had bolted the 17-pounder rigid turret mount. No buffer, no spring, nothing absorbing the blast. When the gun fired, the entire tank shook. The chassis took the full force of the shot through its frame and its suspension. It was brutal. It was crude. Witheridge test-fired the thing from outside the tank 3 times before he was willing to climb inside and try it himself. By any professional standard, it was a monster. But when that shell left the barrel, it could kill a Panther. And Witheridge, the man who remembered Gazala, knew exactly what that was worth. Now watch what happens next, because the order to stop was already being written. The letter came from the Department of Tank Design. It was short, it was direct, it was final. And Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge were to cease all work on mounting the 17-pounder in the Sherman tank immediately. No explanation was given in the order, but the reason was not hidden very deeply. The Department of Tank Design had its own project, the A-30 Challenger. It was behind schedule, it was over budget, it was its trials. And the very last thing anyone in that department wanted was 2 officers in a shed on the Dorset coast, proving that a better answer already existed, built out of a modified American tank and a stolen anti-tank gun, held together by welds and stubbornness. If Brighty and Witheridge succeeded, the Challenger became pointless. Careers ended. Contracts ended. A whole department lost its reason to exist. So they were told to stop. And this is the moment where most stories end. A letter from above. A project killed in a single paragraph. 2 officers reassigned to something harmless. And a year later, British tank crews land in France with the same 75 that had already failed them in Africa. And they die by the thousands in hedgerows they cannot see out of, killed by an enemy they cannot touch. That is the version of history that almost happened. But George Witheridge had been inside a burning Grant at Gazala. He had heard the sound of shells falling away from German armor, and he was not a man who followed orders when the orders were wrong. He picked up the telephone, and he did not call the men who had sent the letter. He called around them. He had spent more than 20 years in the Army. He knew the corridors. He knew which doors opened when you pushed and which ones opened only when you knew who was standing on the other side. And he knew that the men in the Department of Tank Design did not have the last word on what the British Army fought with. Somebody higher did. His first call went to Major General Raymond. Briggs was 48 years old. He had commanded the 1st Armored Division in North Africa. He had stood in the desert and watched British tanks burn for the same reason Witheridge's Grant had burned, because the guns could not reach the enemy. Briggs was now the director of the Royal Armored Corps. Briggs listened. He did not need Witheridge to explain the math. He had lived the math. Every British armored officer who had served against Rommel knew in his bones what happened when your gun could not kill the thing in front of you. Men climbed out of tanks that were on fire, if they climbed out at all. Briggs said the words that saved the project. He said, "Keep going." Through Briggs, Witheridge reached a man named Claude Gibb. Gibb was 44. He was not a soldier. He was an industrialist, Director General of Weapons and Instruments Production at the Ministry of Supply. His job was factories. His job was output. His job was making sure that when a British soldier needed a rifle or a shell or a tank, there was one waiting for him. Gibb did not ask whether the modified Sherman was elegant. He asked whether it could be built. The answer was yes. And then Gibb produced the sentence that ended the argument. Colonel William Watson had just come back from Australia. And in Australia, on the other side of the world, engineers had already mounted a 17-pounder inside a tank. Their own tank, the Sentinel. It had been done, it had been fired, it worked. It was not theory. It was not a sketch on a piece of paper in a shed in Dorset. It had been done. Gibb overruled the Department of Tank Design. The Sherman with the 17-pounder became an official Ministry of Supply project. That was the first twist that saved British armor. The second one hurt. The project was approved, and in the same breath it was taken away from the men who had built it. Brighty and Witheridge, the Royal Tank Regiment Major, and the burned-out Lieutenant Colonel from Gazala, the 2 men who had refused to let the idea die, handed the whole thing off to someone else and told in the polite language of official memoranda that professionals would take it from here. The official history of the war, when it was finally written, would describe them with a phrase that stings when you read it. Highly enthusiastic and devoted amateurs. Amateurs. The man who had been thrown out of a burning tank in the desert and who could still hear the shells falling off Rommel's armor was an amateur. The major who had put a gun that every engineer said could not fit inside a turret and made it fire was an amateur. Their prototype, the locked gun, the shaking chassis, the crude and violent thing they had welded together at Lulworth was set aside, and the project passed into the hands of a man neither of them had ever met. His name was W.G.K. Kilborn. He was in his mid-40s. He was a civilian engineer with Vickers. He had never been inside a burning tank. He did not carry the sound of Gazala in his memory. He had not walked out of Dunkirk with nothing in his hands. What Kilborn had was something Brighty, and Witheridge did not have. He had the engineering discipline to turn a monster into a weapon that could be built by the hundreds and put into the hands of crews who would need it before the invasion. And he was staring at the same wall the amateurs had stared at. 3 feet and more of recoil, 18 inches of space. A gun that was by every measurement anyone could take, too large for the turret it needed to live inside. And now, on top of all of it, a deadline. D-Day was less than a year away. Every obvious solution had already failed. You could not shorten the barrel. That would destroy the velocity that gave the 17-pounder its killing power. Cut the length, cut the punch, and you were back to firing rounds that could not touch a Panther. You could not enlarge the turret. There was no time to design a new one, no factory tool to build it, no production line waiting. You could not remove the recoil system. Brighty had tried that. The tank shook itself apart every time it fired. So Kilborn stopped asking the question everyone else was asking. He did not ask how to fit the gun into the turret. He asked how to redesign the gun so that the turret would not know the difference. And what he did next took 3 months, and it began with turning the entire weapon on its side. The standard 17-pounder loaded from the top. The breech swung upward. The loader dropped a shell into the chamber. The breech swung down. Simple. If you had ceiling height inside your turret. Inside a Sherman turret, there was no ceiling height. The breech would hit the roof before it opened wide enough to load. Kilborn's first decision was to rotate the entire breech mechanism 90 degrees. Instead of opening upward, it now opened to the left. The loader would push the shell in sideways. It was awkward. It was slower than top loader. And it worked, because the turret was wider than it was tall. By using the width instead of the height, Kilborn had stolen the inches he needed. That was only the first problem. The recoil cylinders on a standard 17-pounder sat behind the gun in a straight line, absorbing more than 3 feet of backward travel with every shot. There was no room for that behind the gun inside a Sherman turret. There was barely room for the men. Kilborn threw out the original cylinders. He designed new ones, shorter, fatter, and he mounted them not behind the gun, but on either side of it, one high, one low, cradling the barrel between them. Each cylinder absorbed half the recoil. Neither needed the full length. Together, they stopped the gun in a space the turret could handle. Think about what that means for a moment. The problem every trained engineer in Britain had called unsolvable. The gun is too big for the turret. Kilborn had solved it not by changing the turret, but by changing how the gun lived inside it. Then came the secondary problems, and there were many. The bigger breech meant the loader could no longer escape through the commander's hatch if the tank was hit. So Kilborn cut a new hatch into the turret roof just for the load of man could live long enough to bail out if the 17-pounder attracted the kind of return fire it was going to attract. The radio that normally sat at the back of the turret had nowhere to go. So Kilborn welded an armored box onto the outside of the turret. The crews would come to call it the bustle. It stuck out behind the tank like a growth. It made the whole vehicle look wrong from 100 yards away, and there was nothing to do about it. The radio had to sit somewhere. The hull gunner's position was eliminated entirely. His seat, his gun port, his periscope, all of it stripped out, and the space filled with racks of ammunition, because the 17-pounder shells were longer than the 75s and heavier, and the tank had to carry enough of them to fight. By November 11, 1943, Kilborn had a working prototype. The monster had become a real tank. And now watch what happened next, because it tells you what the men at the top of the British war effort knew and what they were afraid of before the prototype had even completed its final testing, before the War Office had signed off on the performance figures, before anyone had fired the thing in conditions that even resembled combat. An order was placed for 2,100 units. Hold that number in your head. 2,100 tanks ordered before the design had been proven in the field. That was not confidence. That was fear. The men who signed that order knew what was waiting in France. They knew about the Panther. They knew what had happened to British armor in Africa when the guns could not match the enemy's. And they knew, because they had read the reports on the Challenger, that the official heavy tank program would not be ready in time for the invasion. If the modified Sherman failed, there was nothing else. Production began in January of 1944. The factories worked from existing Sherman hulls, mostly the M4A4, which the British called the Sherman 5. Each conversion took weeks of skilled labor. The turret had to be partially rebuilt. The gun had to be factory-fitted with Kilborn's modified recoil system. The new hatch had to be cut. The bustle had to be welded on. The ammunition racks had to be installed where the hull gunner used to sit. Every one of them was a handmade modification of a mass-produced American tank. The crews had started calling them Fireflies. The name was not official. Nobody in the Ministry of Supply had approved it. It came from the crews themselves, probably because of the muzzle flash when the 17-pounder fired. A flat, blinding orange light that lit up the inside of the turret for a fraction of a second and told every German within a mile where you were. By May 31, 1944, 6 days before D-Day, 342 Fireflies had been delivered to the 21st Army Group. 342. For an entire Army group preparing to invade a continent defended by Panthers, Tigers, and the best-equipped Panzer divisions Germany had ever fielded. That was enough for exactly one Firefly per troop of 4 tanks. 3 ordinary Shermans, whose 75mm guns could not kill a Panther from the front at any range, and 1 Frankenstein that could. The men who would crew those Fireflies did not yet understand what they had become. They found out fast. On June 6, 1944, the tanks of the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards rolled off their landing craft onto Gold Beach at 7:20 in the morning. They were the first armored unit to touch Normandy. Among them was Sergeant Wilfred Harris. His Firefly moved up through the sand and onto the road inland. 3 Shermans in his troop, 1 Firefly, his. Within 48 hours, every British tanker in Normandy understood the problem. The Panther was not rare. Intelligence had predicted scattered contact, a few here, a few there. Instead, Panzerlehr Division alone had brought nearly 80 Panthers into the hedgerows south of the beaches. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend had more. They were everywhere, and every engagement followed the same sickening pattern. A British 75 opened fire. The shell fell away. The Panther's gun answered once. A Sherman burned. But something else was happening, something the Germans had not planned for. On June 9, 3 days after the landings, 12 Panthers of the 12th SS attacked the village of Norrie and Besson. A Canadian Firefly of the 1st Hussars was in position, commanded by Lieutenant G.K. Henry. Gunner, Trooper A. Chapman. Chapman watched the Panthers roll across open ground. They came on in a column, and as they turned, they lined up, one behind the other. As Chapman himself later put it, like ducks in a row, he fired. 5 Panthers were destroyed in about a minute. The attack collapsed. That report went up the German chain of command fast, and the German answer came back faster. The order was passed to every Panzer crew, every anti-tank gun position, every Panzer Grenadier company in Normandy. Not every Sherman was the same. One of them had a longer barrel. One of them punched through frontal armor at ranges where the 75 was useless. One of them was killing Panthers. Find it, kill it first, before it fires, before it sees you, before anything else on the battlefield. Kill the long-barreled Sherman. Overnight, the Firefly became the most important tank in every British troop, and the most hunted. Firefly crews started painting the forward half of the barrel white, a trick called countershading, trying to make the long barrel look shorter at distance, blending it into the sky. Some units bolted false muzzle brakes halfway along the gun. Some fitted dummy 75mm barrels to the turret bustle and reversed the turret, so the fake gun pointed forward and the real one pointed backward. None of it changed the arithmetic. 1 Firefly per 4 tanks. Lose it, and the other 3 had nothing. By the second week of the invasion, Fireflies were being knocked out across Normandy faster than replacements could be brought forward. The Germans had learned to spot them, and the crews inside them were learning what it meant to be a marked man in a machine that could not be hidden. Remember that number from earlier, 342 delivered before the invasion. Now think about what happens to a weapon you cannot afford to lose, in a campaign where the enemy has put a bounty on it. This was the state of things on June 13, 1944. The 50th Northumbrian Infantry Division received orders to push south of Bayeux. Take a cluster of villages that dominated the road network. One of them was called Lingevres. The division would attack with the Durham Light Infantry on foot, supported by the tanks of the 4th, 7th Royal Dragoon Guards. Harris's Firefly was assigned to 4th Troop, a squadron. At full strength, the troop had 4 tanks. By the morning of June 14, it had 3. One was already gone. Lieutenant Morrison commanded the troop. Corporal Johnson had a standard Sherman, and Harris had the only gun in the troop in the whole approach to that village that could answer what Panzer Lehr was about to send down the road. The Durhams stepped off at 10:15 in the morning. What they walked into would cost them 353 men in a single day. The attack was preceded by everything the British could throw. Divisional artillery laid a creeping barrage across the fields south of Bayeux. Spitfires came in low, firing rockets into the tree lines. At 10:15, the men of the 6th and 9th Battalions, Durham Light Infantry, rose from their positions and walked forward. Panzer Lehr was waiting for them. This was not a conscript division holding a quiet sector. Panzer Lehr had been built around the demonstration units of the German armored schools, men with combat experience, men who had trained other men. Among the finest troops Germany still had in the field. They let the Durhams come close, very close, 150 yards, the length of a football pitch and a half. close enough to see faces. Then they opened fire, and what followed was 5 hours of fighting at a range where war becomes personal. Hedgerows turned every lane into an ambush. Machine guns covered every approach. Snipers worked the upper windows of the stone farmhouses. The Durhams fought field by field, house by house, with bayonets and grenades and the kind of grinding violence that fills casualty reports with numbers that cannot convey what happened to the men behind them. By early afternoon, Lingevres was taken. 353 men, killed, wounded, missing, in a single day. A Durham officer would later call it the best attack the battalion launched during the entire Normandy campaign. That should tell you what the worst ones looked like. A major named Mogg reached the village center and set up a casualty station in the church. The Panzerlehr infantry pulled back, and now the tanks came forward. 4th Troop rolled into Lingevres to hold what the infantry had paid for. 3 tanks, Morrison, Johnson, Harris, 1 Firefly. Morrison parked near the church, covering the crossroads. Johnson took the south road. Harris drove his Firefly to the eastern end of the main road, the road that ran straight toward Tilly-sur-Seules, straight toward the German lines, and stopped. He was facing east. Behind him, the village. Around him, the Durhams organizing their defense, dragging wounded into the church, setting up what anti-tank guns had survived the advance. 2 6-pounders. Ahead of him, 800 meters of open road, lined with hedgerow, running into territory Panzerlehr still controlled. Harris opened his cupola. He stood up in the commander's position, binoculars to his eyes, scanning east. Beside him, in the turret, in the gunner's seat, sat a young man named Trooper Ian McKillop. McKillop was in his early 20s, quiet, precise. The two of them had worked together long enough to need no speeches. Harris spotted. McKillop fired. That was the partnership. Whether it would work against what was coming depended on something neither man controlled. Whether the enemy came from the front where the 17-pounder could reach, or from a direction where even the Firefly was just another thin-skinned Sherman with nowhere to hide. For a few minutes, the road east was empty. Then Harris saw movement. On the road from Tilly, in the afternoon haze, shapes, low, angular, moving fast. He adjusted his binoculars. 2 vehicles, heavy. The silhouette was unmistakable to any man who had been briefed on German armor in the weeks before the invasion. The long gun, the sloped glacis, the wide tracks, 2 Panthers driving straight down the road at Lingevres, 800 meters away, and closing. Harris had perhaps 10 seconds to decide. Fire first and reveal the position of the only gun in the village that could stop them, or hold and let 45 tons of German steel fire first. He did not wait. Beside him, and McKillop already had his eye pressed against the gunner's sight. The reticle laid across the lead Panther. 800 meters of empty road between the muzzle of the 17-pounder and the front plate of a tank that had until this moment been almost impossible for the British Army to kill. Harris gave the word. McKillop fired. The 17-pounder round left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. At that range, the flight time was under a second. The muzzle flash lit the inside of the turret like a photograph. The tank rocked back on its suspension. The empty shell casing kicked out sideways and hit the floor of the turret with a sound the loader would remember for the rest of his life. 800 meters away, the shell struck the Panther. The tank stopped dead. Smoke poured from the hatches. The crew did not come out. 1 round, 1 Panther. Harris did not pause. He did not celebrate. He did not even lower the binoculars, because the second Panther was right behind the first, already slowing. Its crew had seen the lead tank shudder and halt, but they had not yet understood what killed it. They had seconds to react. They did not get them. McKillop worked the traverse. He laid the sight on the second Panther. He fired again. The second round hit. The second tank lurched, veered off the road into the ditch, and stopped. The crew bailed out and were caught by Durham riflemen who were already moving through the hedgerow to meet them. 2 rounds, 2 Panthers. The eastern approach to Lingev's was shut, and now Harris did something that separates a competent tank commander from an exceptional one. He did not stay in position. Every experienced tanker in Normandy understood the rule. The moment you fire, you announce yourself. 2 burning Panthers on the East Road told every German artillery observer, every anti-tank crew, every Panther commander within earshot, exactly where a 17-pounder was sitting. Stay, and the next shell coming down that road would be for him. Harris ordered the driver to reverse. The Firefly rolled backward, turned inside the village, and drove west through the wreckage of Lingev's, past Morrison's Sherman, near the church, past the Durhams still dragging wounded through the doorway, past Major Mogg's aid station, all the way to the northwestern edge of the village. There was a farmhouse there, and behind it, a row of oak trees, thick and dark against the June sky. Harris put the Firefly behind the oaks, facing west, clear line of sight down the road that ran in from Landis-sur-Agen. He had been in the new position for perhaps 20 minutes when he saw them. 3 Panthers, from the west this time, moving in column along the road toward the village. They had not seen him. They did not know that the gun, which had just killed 2 of their comrades on the opposite side of Lingevres, was now sitting behind a row of trees on their flank. Harris watched them come. He waited. He waited until the geometry was right, until the Panthers were passing across his field of fire instead of driving toward him, until each tank showed him its side. Because a Panther's frontal armor was 140 millimeters of effective steel, but a Panther's side armor was 40 millimeters, less than a third of the front plate, at this angle, at this range. McKillop could go through it like paper. Harris gave the word. McKillop fired. The first round struck the lead Panther in the engine compartment. The tank burned instantly. The rearmost Panther in the column was next. McKillop traversed. He fired again. A shell through the back. The tank stopped inside the village and did not move again. The middle Panther took its round in the running gear, lost steering, rolled another 100 yards on its momentum, broke down near the church, where its crew abandoned it and were captured by the Durhams within the hour. 3 rounds, 3 Panthers, 5 rounds total. 5 Panthers destroyed or disabled, not a single miss. Let that settle for a moment. A tank that Britain's own Department of Tank Design had tried to strangle in its cradle, a weapon built by 2 officers who were ordered to walk away. Engineered by a civilian from Vickers who turned the gun sideways to make it fit. Rushed into production before the prototype had been proven. Handed to crews as the only answer their country could give them. Had just done, in 5 rounds, what no other Allied tank in Normandy could do at all. The fighting around Lingev's continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Corporal Johnson's Sherman took a hit and was knocked out. His crew climbed out wounded but alive. Captain John Sterling arrived from another troop with a second Firefly and put 3 rounds into a Tiger that came prowling up from the south. The Tiger burned. By the time the sun went down, 9 German tanks lay smoking in and around the village. The Durham Light Infantry and the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards held Lingevres through the night. The Durhams paid for it in blood that no report can accurately measure. But the story that traveled farthest from that village was not the infantry sacrifice, and it was not the total number of tanks destroyed. It was 5 rounds, fired by one gunner, and under the eye of one sergeant, in one modified Sherman, and every round found its mark. Within days, the report reached 21st Army Group headquarters. Within weeks, it reached the War Office in London. Within months, it reached the desks of the 2 men who had started all of this in a shed at Lulworth, with a locked gun and a shaking chassis, and an order from above telling them to stop, and who had been dismissed as amateurs for their trouble. What those reports set in motion reshaped British armor for the rest of the war. The numbers moved fast. By the end of June, 149 Fireflies were in Normandy. By the end of July, 235. By the autumn, the allocation had doubled, 2 Fireflies per troop instead of 1. By the time the factories finally stopped in 1945, somewhere between 2,100 and 2,200 had been built. Every one of them carried Kilborn's sideways breech, his shortened recoil cylinders, his welded bustle, his new hatch cut into the turret roof. Every one of them descended from the prototype that had shaken itself apart in a shed in Dorset. The Germans never stopped hunting them. For the rest of the campaign, the order held: kill the long-barreled Sherman first. Firefly crews learned to live as marked men. They painted their barrels. They fitted the false muzzle brakes. They hid behind hedgerows and buildings and burned out farmhouses until the moment came to fire, knowing that the moment they fired, the flash would tell every German gun in range exactly where they were. They fired anyway, and according to contemporary loss reports of the 21st Army Group, something unexpected began to show up in the numbers. The Fireflies, the most hunted tanks in every British troop, were being knocked out at a lower rate than the standard Shermans the Germans had been told to ignore. When you can kill the thing that is trying to kill you, the arithmetic changes. The 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards fought on through France, across the Seine, into the Netherlands. They took part in the drive toward Arnhem during Market Garden. They pushed on into northern Germany, and they finished the war at Bremerhaven on the North Sea coast, a long way from the sand at Gold Beach, where they had landed on D-Day. Sergeant Wilfred Harris survived. He had survived the interwar army. He had survived Dunkirk. He had survived the hedgerows. He had survived commanding the most targeted type of tank in every engagement he entered, from Normandy to the German border. The man from Walsall who had first put on the 4th 7th's badge in peacetime had now worn it through 2 evacuations, an invasion and a war. Trooper Ian McKillop, the young man whose hands had put 5 rounds on 5 targets without a single miss, survived beside him. They did not talk much about Lingjaves in the years after. Old soldiers rarely do. Of Bridie and Witheridge, the records say less than they should. The official history called them highly enthusiastic and devoted amateurs. Nobody invited them onto a stage. Nobody handed them a medal for what happened in a village they had never seen. But the idea, the stubborn, unreasonable, unprofessional insistence that a 17-pounder could live inside a Sherman turret, that idea belonged to them. 2 officers at a gunnery school on the Dorset coast in the summer of 1943 who refused to accept that the next campaign was going to be fought with the same gun that had failed in the last one. If you go to Lingeve today, the village is quiet. Stone houses line the same roads. Farmers work the same fields. There is a memorial to the 4th 7th Royal Dragoon Guards on the road north of town. And for years after the war ended, 2 of the Panthers that Harris and McKillop killed sat rusting at the western entrance to the village. Blackened, silent, left where they had burned. A generation of children walked past them on their way to school and did not know exactly what they were looking at. Go back to where this started. A village called Lingevres, a sergeant in a tank that looked wrong, barrel too long, breech opening sideways, a steel box bolted to the back of the turret where nothing was supposed to be. A tank the system had never wanted. A tank that existed only because two men disobeyed a direct order, because one civilian engineer looked at a wall and refused to see it as a wall, and because a country, running out of time, gambled on a weapon it had not finished testing. 5 shots. 5 Panthers. Not because the machine was perfect, but because the right people refused to let it die before it could prove what it was. They called it a Frankenstein. On June 14, 1944, on a road outside a smoking village in Normandy, the monster answered, "Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, a like helps more than you might realize." It tells the algorithm that people still care about the men who actually fought these battles, and it pushes this video toward others who feel the same way. If you're not subscribed yet, take a moment now, hit subscribe, hit the bell, so you do not miss the next one. I would like to know where you are watching from. And if there is a man in your family who served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, an uncle, someone who came home and did not talk much about what he saw, tell me about him in the comments. Those stories deserve to be heard. I will see you in the next one.